Welcome everybody, welcome to this latest seminar. I'm really pleased to introduce Chris Maggio to you, who's going to talk today about demographic change and perceptions of racism. As many of you already know, Chris is a guest teacher in the department here, and he's a doctoral candidate in sociology at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. And his interests include race and ethnicity, immigration, quantitative methods, political sociology, education, and gender and sexuality. So quite a wide-ranging set of interests. But today's going to talk about some of the research that contributes to his doctoral dissertation on demographic change. And as usual, Chris will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. If you have questions of clarification as you go along, if you put those in the chat, I'll keep an eye out for them and communicate them to Chris. If you have substantive questions, please do, though, keep them to the end for the Q&A session, at which point you can ask in person by raising your hand, or again, you can use the chat if your connection prevents you asking in person. We will, as usual, stop formally and stop recording around 6:05. But if there are ongoing questions and any of you want to stay on after that, and then Chris is happy to stay around for a bit longer, and we can carry on with the questions and discussion then. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucinda. I appreciate the nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see?
Yep.
The screen? Okay, cool.
And are you going to make it full screen?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to quickly, I'll just pop my, actually, I'll do this at the end. I was going to pop my email address into the chat so people could email me if they had questions afterward, but I'll do that at the end. Okay, looks good?
Yeah,
cool.
Looks great.
Okay,
I'll put your email in the chat.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, so as Lucinda said, this is, I'm presenting on this topic of demographic change and perceptions of racism. This is a chapter of my dissertation, which is more generally about demographic change and racial demographic change in the US in the past 15, 20 years or so, and what effect that's had on various sort of like social and political outcomes. So I'm happy to talk about that more generally, but this is particularly about perceptions of racism. And so, okay. So this idea of demographic threat has come up a lot in recent research, focusing on the role of racial demographic change, like I said, in influencing social and political outcomes among whites, usually through this sort of conservatizing backlash framework, right? You're in a place, and well, I'll be more detailed about that actually, but to point out one thing is that it's not only among whites that you'll see backlash. There's been increasing research about sort of demographic backlash between different racial minority groups, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. And this kind of idea has primarily been studied in two ways, though there is other types of ways that have been studied that I'm happy to talk about, but kind of the main two is like exposure to information about demographic change through an experimental approach. So telling people that, you know, for instance, the US is going to be majority minority by 2042 is kind of a common experimental treatment that people use to see what happens in terms of people's political attitudes and racial attitudes and things like that. My advisor, Richard Alba, is critical of this sort of idea that the US will be a majority minority by 2042, but that's a separate kind of issue. And then Maureen Craig, Jennifer Richardson, they do a lot of work in this area. They're psychologists, and you can see their, I'll post Yeah, you can email me if you want to see the references as well, because I've got them in a separate document. So they write a review of that. And then where I'm more focused on is exposure to actual local demographic change. There's actual sort of changes happening in the population of the place people live. And so this Kaufman and Goodwin review is a good one. And again, that'll be in the references. And so the latter is kind of rooted in a lot of classic work on groupthink, Gordon Allport, Blaylock, Robin Williams, and the demographic change literature is kind of a move away from group size as threat, which is often, was written about by Blaylock, by Key, in the US context, at least partially under the assumption that demographic change will be more impactful, noticeable, disruptive to kind of the racial environment. And then also less influenced by the residential selection of whites. So kind of where whites are choosing to live is going to, be part of the story of what the minority group size is, while as, a shorter term change in the demographics might be more influential. And then, it's also less sort of susceptible to this longer term effects of contact. And we can see in this Clausen and McLaren sort of article that over the long term, sort of like immigration backlash might recede as sort of the effects of contact or, potentially selection in and out of places takes root. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but that's just sort of the basic idea of why we would study demographic change. And the backlash has been operationalized in various sort of ways. So conservative far-right voting patterns. I have an article on this that came out in Social Science Research recently, but there's been a bunch of research in this area. Benjamin Newman, Ryan Enos, immigration attitudes, Benjamin Newman again. And then Dan Hopkins has written about sort of the influence of demographic change on increase in restrictive immigration policies. So it's been looked at in a bunch of different ways. Excuse me. But less research has kind of focused on whether or how racial ethnic minorities might experience this backlash. So if there is a backlash to demographic change, are people sort of noticing this? Are they internalizing it? Are they feeling like their local community is sort of, threatened by them, or there's a backlash against the growth of their group, right? And so various studies have linked rapid local demographic change with an increase in hate crimes, for instance. So particularly in predominantly white settings that are rapidly diversifying, you see evidence of increases in hate crimes. And it's drawing on this idea that, defended neighborhoods, that whites will defend their neighborhood, their racial predominance under these circumstances. So outside of hate crimes, I'm kind of asking, is rapid demographic change linked with more general perceptions of racism, perhaps as a result of backlash? And there's sort of suggestive qualitative research on this, studying places that, people say, since this, there's been an increase in, in Jimenez's book, it's US born Mexican Americans saying that, with the increase of immigration, we're sort of feeling an uptick in racial backlash and feeling like we're being targeted and things like that, right? So, but this hasn't really been looked at so much from the quantitative perspective. At the same time, there's research kind of showing that perceptions of discrimination, which is slightly different, but I draw a lot on the perceptions of discrimination research in this study. Discrimination for immigrants in the US, for instance, doesn't show much geographic variation, meaning that negative attitudes among the local population do not necessarily translate into greater perceptions of racism, right? So one possibility is this idea of like the person positivity bias, that people have more negative attitudes towards groups than they do towards individuals. So that may not sort of play out in this like interpersonal setting. And there might be barriers to recognizing discrimination, right? It can be subtle. There might be cultural barriers among immigrant groups to recognizing it. There's lots of reasons why it's sort of hard to perceive, right? And so that's sort of the counter theory to my hypothesis, I guess. So the research questions are basically, do Black, Hispanic, and Asian respondents in the US perceive higher levels of racism in counties where there might be backlash to the rapid growth of their respective groups? Can we link demographic change to perceptions of racism? And does this vary by the pre-existing racial ethnic context, which I've mentioned a little bit already, the level of education, nativity, and I'll talk about these more in detail, but these are the basic questions of the study. And so the data I'm using is the Cooperative Congressional Election Study from 2016, National Voting and Political Attitudes Survey in the US, sizable sample of racial ethnic minorities. Actually, I recommend using this data set for a lot of political attitudes research because it's got a pretty huge sample size, 64,000 people. And then it also has geographic information in the public data set, which is not something that a lot of these surveys have. It has a question related to perceptions of racism. And like I said, information on county and residence. So I'm linking respondents' county of residence to demographic information from the 2000 census and the 2010 through 2014 American Community Survey just before 2016, and looking at demographic change as constructed that way. And so the outcome is this question about racial problem. Okay, so racial problem, it's a statement, racial problems in the US are rare, isolated situations, right? And you can either strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, neither agree nor disagree, somewhat agree, strongly agree. And so one question is, how do we interpret this? So I'm primarily interpreting it as a perception of racism statement. It could also be more generally about racial conflict. And then it's a question of, is this an individual sort of perception or a group perception? It seems like it could be a broader, doesn't necessarily have to be happening to you for you to sort of perceive it, right? That's one thing that's important. And often people will report that they perceive higher levels of discrimination for their group than they do for themselves, right? So that's one way to think about it. And, I'm hoping that it can capture this sort of general like feeling of racism, right? Not necessarily you've been directly discriminated against, but just more generally has been kind of shown in a lot of Joe Fegan's work, for instance, these situations where you feel like you're being sort of discriminated against or treated differently because of your race. And some of these situations that are hard to interpret, they might be a little more subtle. I'm hoping that this can capture that as well. And then so the primary predictor is the percentage point growth in the Black, Hispanic, or Asian population at the county level from 2000 to 2010 to 2014. I forgot to mention this in the slide, but I did put this reference in. Newman and Velez have an article that I draw on, which basically is showing that the county level is a good geographic unit for people noticing demographic change. So they have an article that's showing that people genuinely do seem to be saying particularly when the Hispanic population has grown rapidly in their county, they kind of identify that and say there's been a lot of recent immigration. And then percentage point growth is the most commonly used kind of formulation in the literature, but I also check percentage growth as well, and I can talk about that. But there's no statistically significant results for percentage growth, so I don't really focus on that in this article or this presentation, but I can sort of talk about the difference between those two if anyone has any questions about that. Contextually, I'm controlling mostly for stuff at the county level in the 2010 through 2014 ACS, percent Black, Asian, Hispanic, depending on the model I'm looking at, percent non-Hispanic white, population density, income, and growth. Does someone have a question? Sorry, someone went off mute.
Yes, I was just going to say, Chris, there's a question from Berkay.
Oh, sorry.
He missed what you actually concluded about the interpretation, what you're concluding of the interpretation for the question. So if you could just clarify or reiterate that.
I mean, I guess
going forward, how we're understanding it.
Yeah, I'm describing it as perceptions of racism. I really just laid these out to kind of say, like, okay, as a critique, you could say, well, is this perceptions of racism? Is it racial conflict? Is it, sort of some combination of these things? I mostly describe it as perceptions of racism in the article and in the presentation, but yeah. Does that answer your question, Berkay?
Yeah, but are you going to do some validation on it, or just show some analysis about why we should be interpreting in that way?
So, yeah, I haven't done any validation on it. That's a good point. So maybe I can talk with you about that after the presentation, since you're definitely the measurement expert here. So that could be a way to think about it. But yeah, for this purpose of this presentation, I'm just presenting it as is. Does that sound okay? Okay.
Yeah, you carry on. Yes.
Yeah, and so income and income growth, education and education growth, the percent voting for Trump as kind of a sense of like the political environment of the county that these respondents live in, region of residence, and then kind of, because I'm looking at change in these particular populations, Black, Hispanic, Asian, I'm also just looking at like the change in non-Black, non-Hispanic, non-Asian as a way to say, this isn't just like something to do with general population growth, right? I'm controlling for those things. And generally speaking, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to get at things that might be correlated both with demographic change that I'm looking at and then the outcome that I'm looking at as well. I won't go too much into the individual level controls because they're pretty standard, but it's mostly just, socio-demographic stuff, assessments of the national economy, and then they have variables about the length of residence in your current home, length of residence in current city. I actually tried to look at some subsets by these factors in particular because I was interested if it was the newer or older residents, but the results are kind of inconsistent, so I kind of abandoned that part of it. But anyway, these are the sort of controls. Excuse me. I'm happy to answer questions about these too. Okay, so I look at several different types of models for this. So I just sort of do standard OLS regression as well as ordered logistic regressions. And then I also do multinomial logistic regressions, and I'll kind of talk about why I included that as well. And then also these selection models, which I'll just talk about briefly. So these are the sort of cumbersome names of them: augmented inverse probability weighting, inverse probability weighted regression adjustment. The idea here is that, where this racial and ethnic demographic change is occurring is not random, and it might be related to perceptions of racism, right? And so minorities might select into more liberal areas, which would underestimate the effect of demographic change on perceptions of racism. They might select into areas with large numbers of their own racial ethnic group, which might help to develop a stronger race consciousness, and that could overestimate the impact of demographic change. And so what these techniques do is basically inverse weight observations based on their likelihood of selection to treatment. And that's based on a separate model, which I'll talk about in a second. And they make treatment and control counties more similar in terms of the characteristics associated with selection into treatment. And so more closely resembles a randomized experiment, quasi-causal effect of the treatment, demographic change. And so you have, a treatment and control group that are more similar, right? And then each technique does this slightly differently, which I can talk about that too. But it's a sort of as a robustness check. So it's two different techniques, AIPW and IPWRA. So the model predicting selection and treatment, again, depending on mostly this county level in 2000. So it's predicting which counties saw, higher growth in these demographic change variables. So percent Black, Hispanic, Asian, depending on the model. Percent voting for Bush, if people are avoiding conservative areas for some reason, that can kind of account for that. The economic factors, population size, population density, and the region of residence. And I can talk about this in more detail, but basically I show in the article that the treatment and control groups become pretty similar once you apply the inverse probability weights. But I can talk more about that if anyone wants to discuss. Okay, so now we're getting into the results. So I find evidence that the rapid growth in Black and Hispanic population does predict increased perceptions of racism for these groups, right? They're less likely to say racism is rare or isolated in places where their populations are growing rapidly. I find no evidence of this for Asian growth on Asian perceptions of racism, and I'm going to talk about this later in the slides too. Excuse me, why that might be. And just to note, I mean, I talk in detail about the results of the controls in the article, just because it's sort of an interesting thing to look at. But one thing just to point out from that is there's really no evidence that the racial or ethnic group size is related to perceptions of racism. So I'm finding distinctly that this is about demographic change, not the group size, right? So the multinomial logistic regressions, what I was interested in here is to make sure, so if you go back to the categories, to make sure that what I'm observing is that in counties with this rapid demographic change, there's actually an uptick in these two here, the strongly disagree or the somewhat disagree that racial problems are rare, rather than people are just becoming more neutral on this or something like that, right? So I wanted to see which category you see the kind of uptick in. And so both Black and Hispanic growth increases actual perceptions of racism. They're more likely to more likely to disagree, not simply making respondents more neutral about this. And so just as I use marginal estimates here, but if you move from like the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of Black growth, Black respondents are 4.5% more likely to strongly disagree that racism is rare or isolated, and 5.4% more likely to somewhat disagree. And then for Hispanics, it's same exercise, 6.3% more likely to strongly disagree that racism is rare / isolated. So you actually see them moving to these disagreement categories.
Can I just ask a clarification? So this is this 6.3 percentage points? Or like
no, it's percent.
It is percentage.
Yeah. So I just I translated into so I think these are like translate to like 2 to 3 percentage points or something like that in these cases, but yeah, I just did them as percentages.
Thanks.
Yeah. So now I use the selection models. And again, we see similar results. Black and Hispanic, they're not Asians, are demonstrating increased perceptions of racism in rapidly changing counties. Just to give a sense of the magnitude again, I'm treating this like if you treat this scale. So these selection models don't allow for ordered logit or anything like that. They're just, I'm just using linear models. And if you think of the 5-point scale as like a score, it's an increase in 5 or 6%, or sorry, a decrease in 5 or 6% on the score. So again, more disagreement that racism is rare or isolated. One question that I also wanted to answer was whether there's this secondary transfer effect. And so this idea is that like contact with one group kind of influences your attitudes, not just towards that group, but towards another group as well. And so this is normally used for like positive contact, but I'm kind of using it as this negative contact idea. And so the question is like, does Black growth predict increased perceptions of racism for Hispanics, and does Hispanic growth predict increased perceptions of racism for Black respondents, right? And there's really no evidence of this. So the results really appear to be sort of group specific. And now I'm looking at sort of variation by pre-existing racial ethnic context. So the Hispanic growth predicts more strongly increased perceptions of racism in what I would describe as new destination counties, places with little Hispanic or higher white populations as of 2000. This fits in with like a lot of this literature on new destinations, including some of the work that I've done. And so you see a particularly strong relationship between demographic change and perceptions of racism in these counties that didn't have much of a Hispanic population before. So this fits with like this defended neighborhood hypothesis of backlash against new minority groups, eroding racial dominance. And then Black growth is actually showing the opposite, right? So counties with higher Black populations and lower white populations as of 2000 are showing about 6% increase in decrease in the score, and then the other is not statistically significant. So this sort of fits with a tipping point model of demographic change where Black growth may not generate backlash until it goes beyond an acceptable level in the mind of whites. So like, for instance, you see in this work by Gould, she's talking about whites have an idea in their mind of like, they don't want necessarily to live in an exclusively white neighborhood, but they're also against living in a neighborhood where the Black population reaches a certain point, particularly if it's getting anywhere close to a majority. One way to think about this is that it might be a difference between kind of a relatively new immigrant origin group entering places with little history of immigration versus a group that's already underwent an internal mass migration in the US that in many cases was met with violence and white flight. So it's sort of a different migration history there. Another possibility is that could be sort of like higher race consciousness or awareness of racism in places with larger Black populations that's sort of amplifying the effects of demographic change, and if there's a backlash. So, I mean, one thing that's sort of important, and I talk about this more in the article, is that generally speaking, perceptions of racism are not necessarily correlated with like who you it's some combination of your experience of racism and some combination of your awareness of racism, right? And so often people with higher levels of education have higher perceptions of racism. So part of the story there is sort of like you're exposed to kind of information that may lead you to have different understandings of the prevalence of racism and the prevalence of discrimination and things like that. So I also looked at about education, and Black and Hispanic respondents with less than a college degree report increased perceptions of racism in counties undergoing rapid demographic change, but those with a college degree do not. And so this fits with the qualitative literature in some sense, showing that while the working class may bear the brunt of backlash, while the middle class may be viewed as more acceptable in certain communities. So if you look at like Reader's work, for instance, from the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of white pushback in these Brooklyn neighborhoods of like the increasing Black population, but they make a distinction between the working class and the middle class, and sort of talk about how that sort of the middle class is, you know, more acceptable in the community, and so it's kind of the interaction of race and class in some ways. And then nativity, Black and Asian sample sizes are not big enough to examine by nativity, but I look at US-born and foreign-born Hispanics. They both demonstrate increased perceptions of racism as a result of demographic change or correlated with demographic change. And the magnitude is larger for the foreign-born, but the point estimates and the confidence intervals mostly overlap, so I'm not really sure that there's much of a difference there. I can talk about more of the methodology here too. So why not Asians, right? There's lots of research kind of showing a more favorable reception of Asians among whites in the US. That's one possible explanation, but I also show that Asians tend to be entering counties, or their population is growing in counties that might be less primed for backlash, right? So these counties are less conservative in terms of their Bush voting in 2000. They're more urban in terms of their population density, and they're more highly educated. So these places might not be as primed for a backlash. So that's one possible explanation. And definitely need future research in this. I have an article that I'm like working on right now about sort of why white people have like the preferences for different groups that they do. And so I'm happy to like talk about what I'm finding there, because it might be relevant to this conversation. Okay, so as conclusions, oops, sorry. You know, demographic change has been shown to generate various forms of backlash among whites and perhaps resulting in an increase in hate crimes. This process appears to play out in terms of more general perceptions of racism for Blacks and Hispanics, particularly those with lower levels of education. In other words, if there is a backlash to demographic change, these groups likely notice it. The dynamics of the pre-existing racial and ethnic contexts appear to play out differently for Blacks and Hispanics, perhaps rooted in their different migration histories, but also perhaps in awareness or recognition of racism. And I think future research could explore kind of whether these increased perceptions of racism are resulting in any health impacts, mental health, labor market, if we can link these to more sort of tangible things that are, you know, we know that are linked to increased perceptions of discrimination, for instance. So, you know, I think that's an important sort of research agenda going forward. Yeah, and that's all I have for now. I know that there's probably, you know, plenty of questions to ask, so I'll stop sharing my screen. Lucinda, does that make sense? And then go back.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah,
okay, thank you.
There was lots in there. Thank you for giving me the time to allow plenty of time for questions.
Yeah,
so that was great. Thanks very much. So I need to keep an eye on questions. So who would like? So I think we have Thomas has got his hand in first to ask a question. So Thomas, over to you.
Hello. Thanks, Chris, for the fascinating talk. I think I was fairly convinced by your argument. I was wondering, so you had in your models as a control variable, how long people had been staying in that area, right? Tenure. And I would be interested if you had looked into how the effect, if you want to call it, or the association differs between people who have recently moved to an area and those who had been there for a long time already. Because if there is a difference, if people who move are generally different and maybe for some reason perceive racism or more strongly than those who stay. Then of course you will have this problem that it's those people, there are more people of those in those areas where there's a higher rate of moves to. And so what you're measuring is basically just that these people
their
are there
attitudes
to a higher degree than those who had been staying. So it would at least be worth it to look into heterogeneity in the effect potentially.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. So I mentioned it briefly, but sorry, it might have not been clear. I had tried to look at that, and I was basically finding kind of inconsistent results depending on what you consider long-term or short-term. So it was a challenge to sort of really draw any conclusions about that. But I think you also do speak to like why I'm controlling for it, right? That's one thing, is the concern that it's just like, you know, new people have different attitudes than the people that have lived there longer. Which we actually sort of, well, yeah, it's a possibility, right? So that's why I control for it. I can't say too much clearly about the heterogeneity, just because I don't think the results showed enough consistency. But yeah, it's a good point.
All right, thanks. Sorry for missing that you mentioned that already.
Oh no, it's okay. I probably just like briefly put it out. So yeah.
Thanks. So Vicky, you've got a question. Do come in.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for the presentation. So I was a bit confused with the results regarding education, in the sense that if your dependent variable is measuring attitudes towards group, and it's like this mix you said of kind of experience, but also awareness and perception, like for the whole group, I would expect the more educated to be more sensitive to that. And in relation to that, and then I'm done. Couldn't you, in this data set, which sounds very good, didn't you have also a measure of direct experience of racism? And then wouldn't it be interesting to see both, like how, the attitudes towards the group compared to like a direct experience of racism?
Yeah, that's a question. So to clarify what I want to say about education, it's to say in the regressions, just like the OLS regressions, there is evidence that those with higher levels of education have higher perceptions of racism generally. And there's sort of, I can pop in some references. I'll add those to the reference about maybe why people think that is, but part of it might be like, kind of like you said, like, you know, I mean, you learn about racism in college to some extent, right? I mean, at least in my experience, I learned a lot about the history of racism in the United States in college, you know, certainly more than I did in prior grades. So that's part of it. And then the other one is like, well, if minorities are able to enter sort of sectors of the labor market that are, or residential areas or whatever, that are more predominated by whites, then they are sort of more likely to experience racism directly, in a way that if you're lower income and live in a segregated neighborhood and work in a segregated job, you may not. And yeah, so that result plays out. But what I find is that basically the relationship between demographic change and education seems to go in the other direction. And what I was trying to point out, so like Tomas Jimenez's book, which I referenced a couple of times, he's looking at cities that are undergoing increases in migration from Mexico, and he's like interviewing sort of like longer term Mexican Americans there. And I think that what is pointed out in this is that like a lot of so they're really annoyed about like undocumented immigration in their minds, right? That's what they talk about a lot. But like the markers for them of like who is undocumented are like pretty class specific, right? So it's people who are dressed for manual labor, who are you know, waiting in line as day laborers and things like that. So to me, there's some link of like acceptability or class politics that are potentially going on there. And then again, I said in the writer book that I referenced, it's the same thing where these white Italian Jewish Brooklyn residents are basically okay with like a small number of like middle class Black families to move in, but they are less okay as it's the numbers increase of the working class. And so, you know, my sort of hypothesis about this is that, you know, if there's a group bearing the brunt of the backlash, it may be this more working class population, right? Does that make sense, Vicky? Cool.
Great. So we've got a whole load lining up now to ask. So I think Francis, in order, it was Francis and then Berkay and then Mary Alice and then Johan. So Francis, over to you.
Hi there, great presentation. My question was just, what do the results show if it's the other way around? For example, when white people move into Asian or Black neighborhoods, like with gentrification, do the perceptions of racism, what are the perceptions of racism then?
That's a great question. I didn't look at that. And honestly, I think that this has probably been understudied, although if anyone knows any good references about kind of like the gentrification side of the literature, I would be interested to see that. But yeah, I think just like generally speaking, this literature has kind of focused in this very binary way on minority growth and majority reaction, when in actuality, there's all sorts of more complex racial dynamics and things that could go on. And so I think it's a great research idea and research question. So yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to look at that, you should, or if anyone knows any references about that I don't, then yeah, feel free to share them. But yeah, it's a good question.
Did you want to come back on that, Francis, or is that answered the question?
Yeah. No, just answered. I didn't know. Yeah. So yeah, more research.
I wish I had a better answer. I'm sorry, but it's a good question anyway. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. So Berkay, you wanted to come in.
So thank you, Francis, for asking part of the question that I wanted to ask. Actually, like my reaction to that was, Chris, your models are agnostic to whoever is the ratio, right? So like the way that you estimate these things is basically the rate of minority, rate of majority. It's just the flip side of the same data that you would be actually able to test what Francis was saying. That was what I was carrying in my mind. It's not a different paper, but it's actually a robustness check that I thought that you would want to do, like in looking at the different composition. That's what I was like thinking all along. But
so you're saying a robustness check as like make sure that what I'm looking at is not just some general effect of population growth, right? Is what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I can look at that. I mean, my idea was to, like I said, to control for all other so whatever population growth I'm looking at, right? Black, Hispanic, Asian, I'm controlling for all other population growth in the model. So non-Black, non-Hispanic, non-Asian. But an additional step would be, yes, to use that as the treatment.
Right.
So it's in the OLS models, it's in the order logistic regression models, it's in the multinomial logit models, and it's in the selection models as a control. But you're saying, so it wouldn't be treated any differently in those first three, right? But it would be treated differently in the selection models, which is something that I could look at.
So that was part of the question that I was carrying, but it wasn't my question. Sorry if I don't find.
No. Back of the line. No.
So basically, what you do is relies on the assumption that the demographic change is also perceived by the people, right? So it's the perception, actually, right? So in a way that the mechanism goes through people's understanding and seeing that demographic change visibly in the area that they live.
Yeah.
It goes on understanding better what the county means as a unit of analysis, and how do we care about the county, like within county distribution, for people who are not very familiar with the US county system, actually. So, like, do I know if on the corner of the country there's an increasing number of other racial groups? How do I see that perception?
Yeah. Right. So I don't have a test of that in my paper, but I just popped into the chat this article, Group Size versus Change, Assessing Americans' Perceptions of Local Immigration. And basically they do just that, where they're asking people, something along the lines of like, are there a lot of recent immigrants in your area or something like that. I can't remember precisely what it is. And they link that to the county level demographic change and show that there's a statistically significant relationship between those two things. So yes, generally speaking, in this entire dissertation, I've used the county level. And so there's certainly lots of debate about this in the group size literature of what the appropriate level to look at is. I can also pop in this. The literature review by Kaufman and Goodwin looks at they consistently find that ethnic demographic change across a bunch of studies they've looked at, and I think at different geographical levels, predicts backlash in terms of immigration attitudes and political like voting patterns or far right support or whatever. But they find that it varies by the unit of analysis for group size, right? So I think it's a very good question. But at the very least, I do have evidence that people notice at the county level what's happening in terms of demographic trends, right? Yeah, so if you want to check out the article and tell me if you have any thoughts, because I'm curious to hear. Yeah.
Great, so I think that was your question that time, wasn't it, Rebecca? So we'll move on to Mary Alice.
Yeah, that was a really interesting presentation. And I think my question is quite similar to both Berkay's and Francis's. I was just thinking, I think maybe you've sort of answered most of it already, but like you were talking about interpreting the question as though it is racism. And I just wondered if you had like some way of doing like a placebo test to see if it's actually like part of it could be not so much the racial composition, but just that there is like some change in the local economy that's led to more migration in or out. And maybe it's like partly just like less community cohesiveness that's not directly related to race that could be part of that relationship as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I haven't done a placebo test for that. So that's definitely something I will think about, and maybe I will email you, Mary Alice, and think of how that could be constructed. What I did try to do is control for both the economic circumstances in terms of socioeconomic circumstances, let's say, in terms of income and education, but also the change in those over time. But as well, what the selection models do is weight the treatment and control groups. So ultimately they're fairly similar on these characteristics, right? And so hopefully I'm comparing apples to apples to some extent. But I would be curious to hear what you think a placebo test might look like. So yeah, maybe I'll shoot you an email. Does that make sense?
Thank you. So Johan, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks so much, Chris. Chris, while listening to your talk, there was this moment where I switched from feeling like I've got a pretty good grasp of what you're trying to convey, where there's this descriptive story, namely that in counties that experience the following demographic change, so too in those counties we might expect to see the following kind of change in the perceptions of racism. Then there was this slide where you were describing the selection models that you were going to use that turned this into, I think you used a quasi-causal story. And I had a really hard time wrapping my mind around what is the quasi-causal story that you think is happening. And my best sense of how you were preemptively answering that question was you were describing something about the underlying mechanics of, I mean, I don't remember, something, a weighted something model.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, can you just walk me through the causal or quasi-causal story that you think your study is telling? Because I can make easy sense of it as a descriptive story, but I'm really struggling with thinking about what is the treatment here, and what is the mechanism by which? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll try to tackle this in like a couple different ways. One is to say, you know, what is the mechanism? What is the story? So my idea of the mechanism is basically rapid racial demographic change in someone's county, right? And let's just say white people for the sake of argument, even though we know that it might not just be backlash on the part of white people. There's some backlash that we have been able to measure a bunch of different ways, right? In terms of people's likelihood of voting for far right parties, people's immigration attitudes, people's racial attitudes, people's support for particular policies, conservative policies, conservative politics. We've established that in a bunch of research, including in another chapter of my dissertation. We then say that if people are, you know, changing their attitudes about this, if they are upset about the racial change, okay, well, how are their actions reflected in that, right? And so we have this separate literature basically showing that in counties where not necessarily counties, but just any sort of neighborhood, or it's done at different geographical levels, but places where rapid demographic change occurring. So for instance, where the Black or Hispanic population is rapidly increasing, and particularly in places that are predominantly white, you see increases in hate crimes, right? And I've cited a bunch of those articles here, and I can share the references with you as well. So basically what that is linking, okay, there's some backlash to demographic change, and how are whites, primarily whites, acting on it? They're acting on it through violence in some cases, right? Now, there may be other ways that they're acting on it, right? It could be just a general sort of sense of, you know, disgruntledness about it. It could be, you know, and I cite Fegan because I think he captures a lot of the ways in which people experience racism that are obviously not hate crimes, that are not violence, that are more subtle. You know, you're not being seated at a table when you think you should be, or you're getting strange looks, or someone mutters something under their breath to you, right? And so those are kind of the experiences that I'm hoping to encapsulate a little bit more. And I'm linking, like I said, that to perceptions of racism. Does that answer your mechanism question? Is that helpful for that?
Kind of.
Okay.
With the chair's forbearance, may I? Okay, thank you. The story that you've just plotted out gets us from rapid demographic change through something like the example you just gave is hate crimes, to the outcome of interest here, perceptions of racism. But the talk I heard was rapid demographic change to perceptions of racism. And the story that you gave just now, where it goes through something, that's a story I can make good sense of as a causal story. That's something about, like, something that someone does, like, for example, hate crime, changes the way I perceive whether or not my neighborhood is racist.
I see what you're saying.
The neighborhood simply changing its demographic composition, what I'm struggling with is, how do I make sense of that as a cause of perceptions of racism?
So I think you're right. I mean, it's not the demographic change itself causes the perceptions of racism. It's the demographic change causes the backlash, which leads to some action, which then potentially increases perceptions of racism, right? So, I mean, basically, you're right in the chain is like several steps, right? So I'm hoping that the other research I've done and other people have done establish that intermediary, and I'm just establishing like the final piece. And to your modeling question, yes, I'm making an argument that these models are the best to show that are useful, for the best I can do with cross-sectional data, basically, are useful to show that this demographic change causes this, which causes perceptions of racism, rather than they're just correlated with each other, right? Does that make sense? We can chat afterward too if it doesn't, but.
Great. So I see Coretta's got a question. So what I'm going to suggest is that Coretta's question or answer is the last question and answer of the formal bit of this. But then if people want to stay around or to follow up on some of these issues or new ones, including all the various things Chris said where I could chat to you afterwards, I think, during his presentation, then please do stay around. But after Chris answered Coretta, I'll close the formal bit and we'll stop recording. So over to you, Coretta.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Really interesting piece of work. I wondered whether, and I may have missed this in the earlier slides, but is the assumption that the perceptions of racism are essentially experienced in equivalent ways across the groups that you're mostly interested in? So African Americans, Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, because I wonder whether that's a helpful way of thinking about it. I mean, and I also, I mean, clearly there are lots of different scales that can be used to measure perceptions of discrimination, and you're drawing on one and making a set of assumptions about what that single question in the data set will be addressed in. And I just wonder whether, because certainly in the UK context, there is at least some sense, and I'm thinking back to work that was done in the citizenship survey some time ago, and so a separate piece of qualitative research which looked at different understandings of perceptions of racism and discrimination across different groups. And I think that that's not something that you will be able to capture in the data set that you've got. So I just wanted to, I don't know whether that is different in the US context as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that these groups experience racism differently is okay. A correct, that makes sense. And I mean, one way I've tried to display that in the paper is just sort of like quantitatively. There's big differences in how much these groups agree with this statement. And so, like, generally speaking, African Americans sort of have the strongest agreement that racism is a problem, or racial problems exist, and Asians have the lowest. Now, does that get at the sort of complexity in how these groups experience racism? No. I would actually recommend, I think I referenced this in the talk, but Rosalind Chow and Joe Fegan have this book, Myth of the Model Minority, which is a sort of qualitative interviews about Asian Americans' experiences with racism. And like sort of the notable thing to me, one notable thing to me is that when you're kind of just asking initially, their thoughts on whether they experience racism or whether they experience discrimination, they're mostly dismissive. And then as the interviews go on and they start probing more, they're like, oh, well, actually, I did experience this as a kid. I had this negative interaction and all this stuff. So if the question is, is this question like fully accurately capturing people's perceptions of racism at this sort of complex level at which it exists? I don't think so. And is there much more that I can do through this data set to address that? I'm not sure. But hopefully what I've tried to do is at least talk about the ways in which the qualitative research kind of accords with what I'm looking at. And I would also recommend, I'll try to send this to you as well, Coretta, but there's the Asian American Pacific, National Asian American Survey does a really detailed look at different types of discrimination in terms of like where people experience it in like the workplace and school and public and whatever, but also divides it very detailed in terms of the ethnic background of the Asian groups. And I think that is something too that I can't get at really in this paper, but is really, really important, which is that different groups within the Asian umbrella are experiencing discrimination quite differently and in quite different ways. But I'll send you the paper I have too, because I think that there is something for that may be interesting to you in terms of like just my basic OLS regression results. Like I said, I look at like the controls, and I think that there's a lot of interesting texture in those in terms of nativity, in terms of education, in terms of the part of the country that they live in, lots of different things, and varying between Black, Hispanic, and Asian, which can kind of tell a story of the complexities within these identities.
Thank you.
Thanks, Greta.
Thanks very much, Chris. And you touched on some of the things that I was hoping to ask but didn't have a chance to. So thank you very much. As I say, I'm going to stop the formal part of the seminar now, but please do hang around. Please do leave if you want to leave, but please do hang around if you'd like to talk to Chris further.